afternoon session of the conference, which opens with a keynote by Valarie from Ohio State University. When we were planning this conference, there was a desire to include other forms of representation and notation that are used in other time-based arts or other music cultures. And I invited Valarie because many years ago, actually, I don't know how many years ago, a few years ago certainly, I had encountered on the website of Ohio State University the analysis and notation of two works by William Forsythe, One Flat Thing Reconsidered and Artifact 2. And she's behind them, or at least one of them.
One of the notators.
One of them. And these are quite original notations. I invite you all, they can be still seen, right? I invite you all to go to the website of the dance department of Ohio State University and look at these really interesting ways to notate a choreographic score in a very different way than lab notation or the other dance notations that we listed before. I'm very glad that Valarie has come and will talk to us about it. She's a very prolific and well-known professor of dance, dancer herself, notator of dance, and serves on many administrative positions. I want to do that all. And has notated many works by dance companies all around the world. And so I'm very glad that you will be telling us a little bit about your work and maybe about the scene of dance notation.
You bet.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, so as Sandeep said, I was really excited to get the email last year during the planning of the conference. And I said, are you sure you want a dance notator at your music notation conference? And he said, most definitely. So, so I set about working on this paper about 2.5 months ago. And I started writing it sort of with the bias that you all knew what lab notation was, and you all know what dance notation systems do. And I thought, maybe I need to step back and just provide a little bit of background and history, and then sort of conclude with several different instances of notators who have really looked at how technology has perturbed their whole environment, changed the way they notate, and then changed the way they preserve and document movement. So just to sort of set the stage for you, the notator walks into the choreographer's studio or the director's studio, and we've got a dancing group over here with the choreographer. You have another group over here with the assistant choreographer. You have a musician either composing, or you have different types of music playing. You've got the costumer in the back, usually measuring dancers and designing the costumes. You've got the lighting designer setting out the plot, and all of a sudden, the notator is the one lone soul who is in the studio trying to figure out, where do I begin and what do I notate? And so the idea of preserving dance gives ways to lots of different methods. It's produced over 500 different notation systems for dance since the 1200s. I think many of you probably have heard of Fourier notation, and of course the Benish notation systems that are used in the UK, especially by the Royal Academy of Dance, that is particular to a particular codified way of moving and a particular style of moving. So one of these systems has come about in the last 90 years, and it was created by Rudolf von Laban. The systems theory was, and here he is in the studio with an icosahedron and a couple of other effort shape symbols that he used throughout his lifetime. And in 1928, the lab notation theory or system began with the publication of scriptons in Germany. And two of his students, we have Anne Hutchinson-Guest here. She's in the dark dress. And then we have Albert Knust here and Laban himself. These are two other notators that were also prolific in Hungary as well. So during the course of War II, we had Anne Hutchinson Guest in the black dress over in the United States, and we had Albert Knust over in Germany, and they were advancing Laban's theories. They were using all the same symbols, they were utilizing the same method, the same syntax, the same way of thinking about analyzing movement. However, during that 8 to 10 year time frame, they weren't talking to each other because of the war. And so after the war ended and we were able to actually meet for the first time in Essen, Germany in 1851, we began to try to make the two systems work together and talk. So they're very simple things, like if I've got my arms out here and I'm going to tilt, do I know to take my arms with me, with my body, or do I know to leave them in space? So very simple things, but that changes the whole entire look of the movement, right? You know, what are you doing? Or do you want to do both things? So very simple things, and so we worked over the last 40 years to try to make those little bitty ways of the changes work together so that we can read each other's scores. So while we're working in these codified ways and while we're working in the system, we utilize technologies that date back typically to the pen and paper. And so when I was trained as a professional notator in the late 90s in New York, I was armed with about 20 Ticonderoga pencils, best pencils ever, pencil sharpener, and 2 or 3 legal pads for every single rehearsal I went to. Back then, we didn't really have iPhones yet that were readily available. You had cumbersome, sort of smaller video machines that we could bring in, but most of the things were obtrusive, and as a notator, you wanted to be as inobtrusive as possible. So, so we really always harken back to the pen and paper. However, when we're teaching, over the years we've used overhead projectors, we've used smart boards, we've used projectors, we use iPads. And then of course, moving into the 70s, we had a fabulous project with the IBM Selectric typewriter. And we have worked with computer programs for Macintosh and PC platforms. And then sports analysis machines, and later I worked with motion capture, and I have a colleague right now who's working in augmented reality. So there are lots of ways that notators look at how to preserve and think about how can we do this more efficiently and more effectively and with a better time frame. So with that said, here is 2 measures from a work by B.B. Miller. It was created in 2000. The work is entitled Pray. It was my qualifying score as a professional notator. And you can see here that it's read from the bottom up. This is one measure here, and you can see our little tick marks, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then straight up to the second. So it's a 6-4. It's an arbor part piece, I believe. The black tick mark here tells us that this is a man. His name is Jamie, so he has a J. And the open tick mark here tells us this is a woman, Z, Mira, so we've got her. And you can see that they are connected as they come across, so they've got a lot of supports going on. You also see, what color do you see in here a lot in the symbols? Black, yes, yes. So that means it's a lot of lower level type stuff. It's a lot of center of gravity type work. Here you've got a big turn sign. It's pointing off to the left, so it's going counterclockwise. And then these little symbols are hips. That's a hand, that's a knee, hand, knee. So you're rolling on your hands and knees, and then you're going to crawl forward. So that just gives you a little sense. It's a lot of symbols on one page. And there's a lot of information coming at you. As a stager, these little relationship stage facings tell you where they're facing. So here, right before they're on each other's sides, they're actually facing each other. Jamie's facing downstage and Mira's facing upstage. So while we're trained to analyze and quickly get all that movement down within like 1 minute, in the classroom or in the studio on your legal pad, then you go home and you ultimately analyze it, and you work inside this new computer program that we have that we just love in Lab on Writer. And it allows us to work more efficiently and more effectively. And as we've had different choreographers working from the 1940s and 50s that have very codified ways of movement, very clear stylistic practices, we've gotten more and more symbols. And so the National Council that I sit on, we bring new symbols every 2 years to our meeting, and we talk about ways that we think we need these symbols. So much like I've seen today with some of your new methods of notating and how you use your triangles or your blocks or where the circles go. It's really interesting. So as the contemporary movement practices have become less codified, we have many, many more symbols on our scores today. So looking at, this was my original thought on the paper, but I realized I needed to give a little background. But if you look at a dynamical systems theory model that really looks at how we are learners and how we live and exist in different environments and how our environments perturb our learning and change our learning, you can see that the notator has to remain attentive to selected aspects of the environment. So that's the choreographer or the director really has to be self-organized and fully autonomous, so it has to be an entity in and of him or herself. And really has to respond to the dancers and the movement and to all the multiple contextual things that are going on in the studio. So combining how the notator learns with the technology that has really come on the scene since the 70s, we really have become able to be more efficient over time. And I think that's one of the hardest things for us. From what I've seen over the last 2 days, you all are able to compose within the programs, and that's not how choreographers work. They're not composing within this program. They're composing on people, and then one person is taking all that information and inputting it back into a program. So it's a little bit different, but some of the very similar issues that you all have. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how some of our notators have embraced technology and how they've been challenged by it. So in 1960 to 1973, we have Lucy Venable here on the right in 1970 with a sports analysis machine. She is probably the world's foremost notator. She's still alive today. She was on faculty at Ohio State for a very long time and one of my mentors. She was on the team that worked with the IBM Selectric Lab on Writer ball. So in 1973, they were able to come out with a ball that fit right in here, and it had lava notation symbols. So it had those little hands, had the little plus signs for the hips, had the knee signs, had all of that. And you could just interchange that ball out, plop the ball in, and then you would type. However, you had to have your entire score laid out like this, right? Because all of a sudden, you're no longer writing in pen and paper from down to up. You're now typing across from left to right. So while it was helpful and it did have you move things along and you didn't have to hand draw everything, it actually made it very difficult to gauge where you were in the system. So only about, I think, 40 or 50 scores were finally laid out with the IBM Selectric typewriter. So, and I was able to provide a Selectric typewriter because that's my father's that he still uses today. So based on that, Lucy talked about, and this is Lucy here in the late 90s. And she says in her own words about the IBM Selectric typewriter, "I knew where we were aiming and I helped with the design and how we would make the symbols. And it involved determining how many strokes you might have to make so that you could make them longer or shorter for timing. We could type the strikes for high level, and of course we could put a dot in the middle for middle level. But the low level still had to be filled in by hand, and you still had to type from left to right. It was cumbersome, and we really needed to be able to go up and down the page." So learning from that experience, Lucy began to think about how she could use computers. She knew they were coming on the market. She was at Ohio State and was working with another colleague, Chuck Surrey, who in our neck of the woods we think of as the father of animation and has the Advanced Computing Center for Art and Design nowadays there. And, but he was using punch cards to create his animations and to create his artwork. So she knew that after the IBM Selectric of having to type from left to right, that punch cards were not going to help. So she just sort of bid her time, and she lobbied to get a little Apple computer for the secretary in the Department of Dance. So in 1980, the Apple appeared on the secretary's desk, and she worked with several different graduate students. And from there, she then was able to get funding from the Mellon Foundation in the United States, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts, and funding from Ohio State University's CIRRMT program. And she worked with Scott Sutherland here on the left, and with David Rowley here on the right. And I did notice earlier today that several of you had the Pompidou Center thing. David has been working there for quite a long time, so I don't know if any of you have come past him, but together, this team created what she had envisioned, which was a program that would allow you to use computer graphics, lay out your score, and divide your time probably in half, if not more. And so they originally first produced it in 1890, and then later they rewrote the language into C++ in the 2000s. And today it is free and downloadable from the Department of Dance at Ohio State University's website. So if you ever want to try it out, you certainly can. Let me exit this for a sec. And I do have Lavenrader up here. Let's see. So it kind of works on the idea that you would have a staff. So I just put 12 counts in my staff here. This is my little starting position. So I've got all of us standing on 2 feet. And then I can come over here to my little toolbox and I can say, I want to walk forward for 2 counts on the right foot. And I'm going to do it in mid-level. And then I can come up here and say, I want to walk forward for 2 counts on the left foot. I'm going to do that in mid-level. And then I'm going to walk forward for 1 count in low level. And then I'm going to flip it to the opposite side and then move it up. And then I'm going to take this little guy here, copy and paste him, and come over here. So you can see that this is much quicker than having to handwrite all this out with pen and ink and put it down. So now you have a little phrase that allows you to stand up and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And so you can just immediately start moving based on this. You can also put floor plans. You can use different tools. I noticed some of our tool palette looks very similar to some of your tool palettes. We can make different things that work on our floor plans as well that can go off to the side and give additional information about the dancers and what they're doing. So it's downloadable, it's free, you can play with it, and it's just sort of interesting to see. So these are all projects that are really focused on helping the notator save time and helping the notator lay out the score. But like many of you have talked about over the last 2 days, there are problems and we do make editing mistakes. And so part of the issues that of course we all have because we're human is if we're drawing it out or if we're inputting it in a computer, we will have editing issues. Or we will have something that doesn't quite read what we thought we notated was not actually what we meant to be performed. And so along the same lines in the 1970s, another whole set of researchers were looking at how technology could then relate to what the notator writes. So in 1974 at Simon Fraser University here in Canada, Zella Wolofsky created a computer program that output stick figures. And and all I could find were drawings. In her dissertation, I couldn't really find any animation, so I was not going to do the drawings. And then around the same time, the current director of the Dance Notation Bureau in New York was working with a group at University of Pennsylvania, and they were also looking at how they could output or animate the Laban symbols. So now they're trying to get the computer to read the Laban symbols and actually perform the Laban symbols. So those projects also gave way to what was a pretty successful project that's still riddled with some issues. In 2000 to 2006, we had what was termed the Laban Dancer Project. And that was, of course, led by Eileen Fox, who was a certified professional notator and the then director of the Dance Notation Bureau in New York, Lars Wilkie, who's the programmer in Credo, Tom Calvert at Simon Fraser University, who had been on Wolowski's dissertation committee, Rhonda Ryman, who's at the University of Waterloo and also a notation professional. And so this project received multiple National Endowment for the Humanities grants and also Mellon Foundation grants. So this focused really on taking the Laban writer score, and inputting it into the computer, and then having this little animated person read what we've written. So there were many of us that met to sort of determine, okay, I'm starting here, I've got both my feet in place, I've got both my arms down by my side. Okay, I'm gonna walk, I'm gonna step, I'm gonna go here, and I'm gonna go here. Now, what's the pathway? So we had to actually teach the computer the rules and syntax of how you would move your arms from here to here, or from here to here. This is the rule. If it goes from low to high, it's always along the line of the body. But what if I want my arm to go this way instead? So you've got to write that in there because the computer knows the rules, but it can't quite always utilize them all the time. So part of the problem became that we had to code so much into it that you couldn't, it couldn't always read what you wanted it to read. And so really it just became about being able to read the steps and read the arm and leg gestures, which was helpful, but it didn't really fully provide, sort of upside down movement and what we were looking for, and if we're facing the right way and that kind of stuff. So this was a highly successful project, but it did stop in 2005. So we're still searching for that check and balance, for those editing tools that it looks like many of you all are searching for as well. So I was a professional notator in New York during the 2000s, and I analyzed and played and served on teams with all these different projects. So it really influenced how I looked at what I wanted to notate and how I wanted to notate, and what the score of the future could look like. So I had the opportunity to notate a work by B.B. Miller. She is an African-American choreographer. She has had a company since 1987, established in Brooklyn. And she works in the postmodern idiom, and like many contemporary modern choreographers, she is influenced by text, by what's going on in the world today, by interaction, by many different things that are not just working in the same style in the same way. So a little different than how notators have been trained in the past. So as I began to notate, I realized that there was a lot going on in the studio, and I wanted future generations to be able to figure out and experience BB, not just her movement, which they can see here. Here's a great phrase from the opening section of her work. And while you can read her movement, sometimes it helps to have the energy or the personality or even just a little bit of who the person is that's creating this work. And so I quickly wrote a grant, I got money, and was able to get videographers into the second part of the rehearsal process. It was a 10-week process. And so what we did was we targeted specific phrases that were in the dance that the dancers were having trouble with. And so when BB was teaching this kick out
learned that this might be a good place to find video, edit it, and we wanted to say in the score, go to this little spot and you too can hear BB or see her teaching this phrase. So I had two things going on. I had one, I had to get a score that was paper and that the old notators would approve and appreciate. And then we wanted to get a score that could be used in the future or that could be enhanced somehow. So I worked with a couple of programmers, and very simplistically, we created, back then, a CD-ROM. And later we moved it to a DVD-ROM, and then we have parts of it actually as streaming video up on the dance department. So here you are, you're in the first section, and you say, wow, I really want to know more about this particular measure or this particular phrase. So you can say, all right, well, I'm going to go here, and I'm going to find it. Here's your little video. So that's BB. I mean, this kind of information is hard to get 30, 40 years later in a non-codified contemporary environment of movement. So you can also say, well, look, I'm working on a different note and I don't want to have to scroll through the whole score. I just need to find this one particular one. So then you can also go through and look at it from a specific note point of view. For the full birds, there's this kick out section. It's interesting to hear her verbalization, her cues, her breath. I mean, yes, the turn and the kick and the taking the whole left side of you is written right here, but it also helps to have another piece of information or another way of coming to the movement. So, so doing that project sort of led us to a larger project that we did at Repertory Dance Theater, which is the national repertory company in the United States. It's staged and it's housed at Salt Lake City, Utah. We worked, it was one of their anniversaries, and they wanted to create a work that had been created on them in 1868. It was a work that dealt with the climate in the United States during 1968, much of the political climate, and it was created by a Jewish American choreographer, Anna Sokolow, who is very famous and does have some aspects of codified movement in her canon of works. Sokolow is deceased. But we were able to work with the director of the Anna Sokolow Foundation, and I worked with Sokolow when I was a student at Juilliard. So what we did was we pulled the score up, and the score was not the beautiful Lava Rider score. It was actually handwritten. It was incomplete. It was missing the first 5 minutes of the dance. And all we had was a film from Lincoln Center from 1970 when the company toured through. So it wasn't an ideal situation. So we came up with the idea that we were going to look at the execution of the movement, the coaching. We had access now to motion capture at Ohio State, and then sort of looking at Anatole Veroux's music score, who created the work for Sokolow in '68. So we pulled together several of the original cast members. We brought the director out, we had videographers, we had me as a notator, and we all worked together to create this work. And so we said, gosh, we need to really go ahead and do the same thing with aspects of the score. One, we renotated aspects that were missing. Two, we put in the BB notes idea next to movement that wasn't working. And then we said, we now have the luxury of having a beautifully shot current work. We had digitized the 1970 film, and then we were able to motion capture some of the main movement aspects. So we thought that would give us a different look at how to complement the notation, and and not really working with people's faces and people's bodies, but looking more at what the actual movement was. But I'll be curious to hear what you all think of that. So I can just play you here. See, we can get close-ups, we were able to scan, we were able to do this without an audience, so we could place the video at different aspects. I know for many of you who do musical recordings, that would seem pretty normal, but for dance, it actually, at that point, was still very expensive and very time-consuming. You have to pay everyone to be there. It was not always available to us. We were really fortunate to be able to do that. Here is the 1970 film of the same spot, and you can see sort of the difference in quality. So we said, you know, it might be nice to motion capture. So we worked with the Advanced Computing Center for the Arts and Design, which is the center that was started by Chuck Surrey in the 60s. And we worked to motion capture the exact same movement. These are two of the dancers that flew out from Utah to Ohio. So this is, you have to remember, this is 2005 technology now. So it's a little different now. But at the time, you can see we've already lost Shara's one ball here, Joanne Fabric's ball had fallen off already. As you can see, here go the arms up. And then here they come down and through. So it gives you a different perspective. It's another lens through which to view the movement, to analyze the movement, to analyze Sokolo's choreography. Think about choreography differently and think about what is notating or preserving movement look like and what is the format for it. So this really worked as a complement to the law of notation score, which we eventually cleaned up and sent back to the Bureau. And this project in, I think, 2010 then received the award for the best practices for preserving dance by the Dance Heritage Coalition in Washington, D.C., out of the Library of Congress. So I will just, in sum, give you my little one-pager that numerous methods really are used to record movement and represent movement and style so that we can discover the dance's meaning and the context. And this really requires any notator, not just law notators, but any notator to embrace new ways of preserving dance. The notator and his or her subsequent director, whether it's directed a week later or 50 years later, tells a story of dance, and it utilizes different representations and different preservation forms. And over time, the notator truly has to change and grow as they record and analyze movement. So the notators have to become self-learning. Their learning has to change the entire system. The system has to change them, and they have to have a new way of understanding and making meaning. They have to be adaptive and self-individualized, And they have to have the process of implicit self-learning that accounts for self-individuation and self-change. So the question continues in the dance field and in the lab notation field, how do notators interact with technological advances to preserve dance? What is the dance, and what part of the dance are you going to record or preserve? How do we want the dance to be perceived in the future? Is that different from the choreographer's perception? As a notator, one hopes that the dance does not become stagnant, that it doesn't just live on the shelf, but that it lives. And we want to think about future generations creating the works together with the score, with the supplemental technological materials. So the recording of the work has to have enough information to provide future readers and learners of the dance with the tools that they will need to create the dance. The implication of helping dance notation learners recognize the fact that dance is defined by its past, present, and perceived future context changes how notators are trained to see, think, and feel. The notator as learner is required to be malleable, open to new ideas, to new people, and must be aware of their surroundings. This includes the physical space, the atmosphere, and the relational practices. While the traditional aspect of the notator's job will always be to write down the movement so that it can be created in the future, the traditional aspect of the director's job will be to create the dance from the symbols. However, they must embrace the flexibility and learn to adapt to technological advances if each one wishes the discipline of dance notation to continue to permeate the field. Thank you.
Survey of the techniques and the history of notating dance. So are there any questions?
Go ahead.
Here.
Okay. Thank you. I have so many questions. I don't even know where to start. And also thank you for this really inspiring presentation. So I guess the first thing that came to my mind was like, okay, so time goes from bottom to top.
Yes.
So how would you combine that with the musical score? That's probably something that's hasn't been resolved yet.
Oh, no, it's very easy.
Yeah.
I guess I don't really have anything on my computer. So the musical score is turned on its side, and it's run along this way in sort of simplistic scores, but in today's day and age, usually the notator takes the musical score and numbers the measures so that, if this is measure 16, you have your measure 16 of the score, and then you can say, here's the kick-out section, and so you'll say kick-out section above that part of the musical score. So the notation score is completely laid out according to the musical score. Now, part of my issue as a notator with Phoebe's work in the first section, the little birds, the little hummingbird section, was there was no score. It was all done through felt group timing. And so in that case, I tried like with a metronome, getting a pulse. I tried the time with stopwatches. And the dancers would change according to the day. Like some days it would take 5 minutes for them to do the section, and sometimes it would take 11 minutes. So it was really difficult. So I began to just notate relative to each phrase. So if one phrase took a longer time than this little short phrase, regardless if they took very, very slowly to do it, and then they did a little slower, or if they did it very quickly, and then super quickly, it was still all the same relative time.
Okay.
And then I wound up giving metronomic markings of like from 80 to 110, so that if you wanted to get the pulse, you could see the tick marks and figure that out as the director. So that was the long answer to yes.
Thank you. My second question concerns the motion tracking.
Yes.
This was quite striking, and I was just wondering whether someone could come up with a system of automatic translation, motion tracking to lab notation.
That, I would love that.
So, are there any research projects in this direction?
There aren't, not that I know of. I think part of what we came away with this motion capture of these phrases is that it took so long to clean the material. It took probably 2 weeks to clean just 20 minutes worth of dance. So, and then, I mean, these little stick figures are the stick figures you get out of the program. But then what we attempted to do was animate them as well, but that didn't go so well. That looked really, it looked like, you know the little fighter people that we used to have that were red and blue? Yeah, it didn't look good. So we just kept these. And so we haven't figured out a way to make that tell the Laban Writer program what symbols to use, you know, forward, middle, drop down, play slow, turn, come back to the head. So we haven't figured that out
It
yet.
seems like this is something that, you know, a computer science department could be very interested in because it really involves most sophisticated tools of gesture, following and interpretation. So I think that's quite worthwhile. So maybe you could also look into opening up with the computer science department.
That would be good.
But there's actually, I don't know if you know of their work, Martina talking to them
No.
in Montreal. They have developed for the Montreal dance scene, they've developed a motion capture system, and what they wanted to do is to preserve individual dancers' body physical types. So how does a particular dancer dance? And they captured their bodies and then created animated figures that look like this dancer. And so you can actually now create a choreography with dancers who have never met.
Right.
And created a video of that. I mean, they worked extensively, I think, with the Montreal gaming industry, Ubisoft.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a kind of, I don't know how far that got, I saw it a few years ago. But I found it very, very nice that you can actually recognize the dancer from their figure, so that it was a person, not a stick figure.
I mean, when we were motion capturing Andy and Chara, you know, we could immediately see their habits even as dancers. They come through on the motion capture. You think you're going to strip away like the personality of the dancer, but you don't. You wind up just recognizing more of their movement preferences and movement choices. It's really great. Yeah, no.
Thank you for the keynote. It was very inspiring. I also had the same questions as Georg, but I'm going to ask that again.
Sure.
Now, is there any reason for which at some point it was chosen to represent time vertically, while all the music, all the text has always been representing time horizontally?
I don't know. We'd have to ask Laban, I think.
Yeah.
So.
And why did the people stick with that? Where it's
Well, on this last page,
and then outside are on this.
Mm-hmm, yeah, on this page that I had on it actually has 4 more stabs, and one of the things that you have to do in dance is to be able to have. So you all go down in your music typically, right? You know, and you've connected your stabs and you've got the different instruments there. So we turned it the other way, I think, because they were able to show more people all at the same time. So some of my scores have like a 3-page layout where you have to open the 3rd page, and so you can have like 16 stabs going across, and then they're all reading together because sometimes they have to link up, or you've got different people holding things. And so at the point when Laban created it in 1828, he was mostly doing movement choirs, and everybody was doing the same thing. It was in Germany, and they mostly used floor plans and different different ways of moving as a group here. But as it's gotten more and more complicated
So we need horizontal to lay people out and vertical to write their movement.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm seeing why you just kind of turn the page and all but I get that. I have another question, if it's possible to. Because
Sure.
I'm really interested. And the question is also a provocation of some sort, but I really want to have a straight answer on that. What's the notation for? I know that there's an answer for every choreographer will have his or her own answer to this question, but in general, you've spoken a lot for preserving dance movements. I think that music notation, that's a tiny fraction of what music notation does, for instance, because music notation is an abstraction to give, I would say, combinatorial power to a set of abstract rules. So that's the same thing probably with lab notation. You start to play with the items and you say, okay, but I can also do that. And that's interesting.
Yeah, so I can give you the party line, or I can give you my own personal opinion. I believe that you cannot, I'm going to give you my personal opinion, I believe that you cannot replicate a dance exactly as it was. You're never going to have the same dancers, they're not going to be trained the same way, you're not going to have the world circumstances the same way. So I believe that as a notator, I should hand my score off to the next director and say, blessing, you figure it out, you make it completely applicable to your dancers, and you all make it current to today's practices. However, I'm not the choreographer. So you have to have the choreographer or the trust of the choreographer coming in and actually agreeing with you or saying, no, you gotta do it this exact way. And I've had both instances as a director. And of course, I can tell you, hands down, the more interesting one and the more excitable one is the one where you get to make it your own. I mean, when you're just stodgily trying to reproduce exactly what happened in 1950 with Pascal and Fugue, it's just not the same type of experience as you can have as if it could be updated costuming, or, I mean, we have just using all the technological advances we have of today, including costuming, lighting, audio, and dancing. Yeah.
Question by Nancy. Well, this isn't exactly a question, but I wondered whether, and I've got flimsy evidence for this, but I wondered whether the vertical orientation was something from theatre, in terms of like how lighting and so on. And my flimsy bit of evidence is, I think probably a lot of you have seen that Laszlo Mahoy Notch sketch for a recognized eccentric, which is arranged like that. But I think, well, still from a musician's point of view as well, I guess the other thing would be that it seems unusual to go from the bottom up.
Mm-hmm.
And there is some notation go from the top down.
Yes. I mean, I don't know. I've never questioned why. I've just done it. So.
And the only score that I know of which is exactly like that is I think Borislav Schaefer, is that his name? Yeah, it's called, I can't pronounce it in Polish, Profni, something like that. And so it has a piano keyboard at the bottom and then graphic notation. Well, it's not really graphic, it's kind of like a piano roll written above it in two lines. It would fit beautifully in the decibel score player, actually.
And Borislav said that it was better for the piano because you always hear your fingers.
Yeah, so and it's kind of like, well, and it's the Guitar Hero paradigm.
But all my piano scores go up like that. And my percussion scores will go up like that because it's kinesthetic. It's like that's your and the same with percussion. And that I think in dance it's a little bit of a combination of bird's eye
It's the left, right.
thing and theatre upstage downstage. You always talk about it
Yes.
back and then
Yes.
talk about it side to side. I think it's probably right into that.
You almost lay the hinge on the ground.
Yeah, people that move through these steps.
Another
Let's
question?
talk about it.
Yes, we have seen now there is a possibility of motion capturing the results, and you said that normally it goes like that. Choreographers work with dancers to create the choreography. That must be very expensive because we composers don't work for composing with musicians. So, in fact, you could do it with a computer now.
Yes, and in fact, I believe one of the things that Tom Calvert worked with Merce Cunningham is creating dance forms. Yes, yeah, and life forms. Thank you. Yes, put dance and everything, and that is how Merce created in sort of the last decade of his company. I have a couple of friends that were in the last iteration of the company who are now back on faculty at Ohio State, and so they talked about sort of they would get their printout of what Merce was thinking they would want to use. And so in that way, yes, it was much more actually time efficient and effective. And in fact, when I have two works that I've reconstructed from score using my student population at Ohio State, I've actually handed the score to the dancers because they read notation. And they came in already knowing and having an idea of where they were in the space and what the movement was because they had actually read it. And I found that just sped up the whole entire process. So, so yes, it is extremely costly for a choreographer to create because while you're creating, you're using the people. So you can't do it by yourself. It's extremely team-oriented.
There was Jonathan and then you.
Maybe coming back to that XY temporal axis, I had the chance to see Merce Cunningham's notebooks, and he thinks in terms of trajectory, right? So there's no time axis. Is that
Right.
something other choreographers do still?
Yeah, oh yeah, sure. Lots of people, I mean, so in the case of the one work I talked about with Bibi, she wasn't really concerned with time. She was mostly just concerned with the movement and the relationship of the dancers. And the dancers actually came up with a time, or with the timing, or the relative performance sequencing. So that's a little different than how Merce had worked towards the end. But yeah, for choreographers not to be concerned with time is very typical. And in fact, it's really frustrating for the notator or the person trying to document the work.
I don't want to open up a discussion about paper versus digital media. Of course, paper has its own merits in it, and we still have documents that are 2,000 years old that were written on papyrus. Nonetheless, my partner, she's a composer, has recently done a dance theater piece with a Chinese choreographer, and they didn't go through the pain of notating it on paper. They just took a video of it, of all the motions. And so my slightly provocative question is, why do you even go through the pains of notating things in Lava notation if you can actually take a video of it and use the video as a tool to recreate the dance?
So I have a story. So my current graduate student reconstructed a work by George Balanchine. It's a very famous pas de deux, Tchaikovsky pas de deux. It's created on Edward Villela and Violette Verdi. But the most famous recording of it is by Mikhail Baryshnikov and Patricia McBride. The work was notated after the Baryshnikov and McBride video had been taken. So it was notated around 1972-73. It had never been reconstructed from the notated score, so my grad student said, hey, I want to do this. We have a very fabulous regional ballet company. They agreed to work with us, so Amber reconstructed the Balanchine work. And it seemed fine. It seemed to match what we'd seen of different variations, different films. But each filming had different ways of performing the movement. So If it was Meryl Ashley, she would do PK pirouettes off stage one way. If it's Patricia McBride, she's not going to do the PK pirouettes. If it's Violette Verdi, she's going to do a lot more jumping. So all of a sudden, you have 3 different versions out there, 3 different filmings of them, and what's the dance? And then to top it off, the notator is usually given some video to refer back to while you're finishing up your score. The notator who had notated this Balanchine work had been given the Baryshnikov and McBride video or film. It had been recorded in Nashville, Tennessee on a very small stage that was not appropriate for the piece. Baryshnikov had 103 fever, and Patricia McBride had a fracture in her right leg, and so they slowed down and took out steps of the entire coda. And that was the part that got notated. So that film is actually a real detriment, even though it's got these fabulous famous dancers in it, and the score mirrored that. So it's just a really real detriment. So one reason we try to notate at least phrases is because you can actually notate, does the palm go down, does it go slightly to side right, is it up, where are the fingers this way, are they that way, what's going on? So the detail is lost many times in film or video or whatever other kind of media. So that's why I'm a big proponent of having all different types of lenses to see one particular thing and to know the context in which they were shot or produced. So.
Yeah, thank you. I have 2 questions. I'm curious, what's the most most imperceptible or hardly perceptible movement that little annotation could notate? Like the slightest move of the shoulder, how would it notate that?
How would it notate that?
Is there a degree to much in music, like the tonal system was only given for certain pitch values and then had to be expanded. Is there sort of a similar thing that's happened where the perceptive range of movements wants to be more and more subtle and the notation system can't account for it?
No, we just make up new symbols.
We do that as well.
Yeah. So we meet every other year between Asia, Europe, and North or South America, our international council. And so then all of us who have said, hey, look, I can't figure out, given the symbols I have, how to notate this movement. Here are 3 choices I have. Here is a symbol I've come up utilizing these 2. What do you all think? And so everybody workshops it, and we spend 10 days together, we talk about it, we come up with the rules and syntax for it, and then we vote the symbol in. So we're going to be actually in Essen, Germany in 2021. It would be great to have a day of overlap to talk about some of the technological issues and some of the analysis issues and actually how you make up new symbols. But yeah, so we just make up new symbols.
Cool. My second question was, so you mentioned at the beginning of your talk how there was, I forget the number you said, thousands of different movement notations.
Like 500.
500. Is there a reference you can point me to the top, there's encyclopedia of all those different?
No, we have a course if you want to come take it. 7901.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.